Hi, I'm Samuel Hollywood Summers. I'm embarking on a generative music project that will respond to the emotions of the audience members. The working title is Emotional Response, and I'm being supported in the research and development phase of this project by the Southwest Creative Technology Network and by Kaleider. And for the duration of this project, I'm going to be resident at Kaleider, part of their resident community, more so in spirit than in actual physical presence due to the lockdown that we're in with the coronavirus that's happening at the moment. But I'm very excited about this project and I'm grateful for the support that they are offering. So first of all, I'd like to define what I mean when I say generative music. Now, to me, this term describes music where part of the compositional process is completed not by the composer, but by a different agent. This agent could be a computer program, it could be a human performer, it could be the rules of a game, or it could be any other mechanical system or other system capable of providing some sort of output that can influence how the music turns out. Now, this definition is quite broad. It covers a lot of things that some people might not consider to be generative music. But anyone who has a more specific, more narrow definition of generative music, the music that is described by those definitions will also fall under generative music as I describe it. So I'm happy with the definition. The definition appeals to me in its breadth. So basically anything where part of the compositional control, that compositional authorship, is taken away from the composer and given to something else. Algorithmically driven computer music is what most people will probably have in mind when they think of generative music. Now, it's usually aleatoric in nature, so it will have some sort of randomness built into the code, some sort of reliance on probabilistic randomness to influence choices and directions that the music goes in. In the mainstream, people who have done this include Brian Eno and his Music for Airports and various other ambient music projects of his have generative methods in how the music is created. They're often open-ended, they could run indefinitely or for very long times and have this sort of randomness following certain rules written into the program. Brian Eno selects things like the instruments, the notes within a scale, the particular type of structure or the way that this is going to behave, but there's a lot of randomness built into that, and so it's generative in that it can be different every time it's performed, and he's not making those decisions himself. He's made a set of decisions in advance, and then there's other decisions given to the computer program that will happen at the time of the performance. Another type of generative music that is in the mainstream is the use of things like modular synthesizers in dance music, electronic music, and a lot of experimental music. Now, anyone who uses a randomizer as a control voltage input to any other module in a modular synthesis, that's a generative process. You're not choosing which voltage is going to be there, you're randomizing it, and so you're inviting some sort of process or agent in there that is not being set specifically by you. So these control voltages can be used to control pitch, playing random pitches. You can randomize the amplitude, the filter cutoff frequency, basically any sort of musical characteristic or property you can have controlled at random. You're inviting a generative process into your music making. So this actually happens not just in weird experimental music that thinks of itself as generative music, but it's also in the mainstream, in pop music, in dance music, and so on. So two key features of generative music, two of the things that people often strive to achieve when they're making generative music, is to have an element of unpredictability, something that surprises the composer that they wouldn't have come up with if they were just following their usual process, a more traditional approach to writing out the music note by note, or having some sort of harmonic structure and writing some counterpoint. All of these approaches, inviting in a generative process can help the music go down routes that would otherwise not have happened. So there's that side of the motivation to make generative music. The other side is that generative music is often open-ended. It doesn't have a fixed structure, it doesn't have a fixed length. It could go in any one of however many different ways. Some of them are more open-ended and more unpredictable, and some of them are a bit more tightly structured and scripted, and there might just be a little bit of variety for one small section or whatever. But yeah, this open-endedness, this unpredictability are two of the things that people strive for, that motivates them to make generative music. Now, for emotional response, I'm going to achieve this open-endedness and this unpredictability by delegating some of my compositional processes, some of those decision-making, those composerly actions, to both a computer program and to the audience that interacts with this installation. So on the one hand, I will create a computer system that builds in some sort of aleatoric processes that rely on statistical probabilities, randomness, or that follow a set of rules, probably a combination of this. And also, I want interaction with the audience. Now, when I was putting together this proposal that I submitted to the Southwest Creative Technology Network and Kaleider, one of my aims is to widen musical participation, and more specifically, wider participation in the creation of music. Now, loads of people everyone, basically, all people have a sense of musicality. They are in some way musical. And although some people don't consider themselves to be creative, acts like reading are actually incredibly creative acts. The words on the page don't alone conjure up all of the imagery that you imagine when you are reading. There's a lot of creative processes happening in the brain as you interpret those words and project into your mind's eye scenarios, characters, people, images, emotions. It's a very creative act to read, and I think it's a very similar thing when you're listening to music. It's a very musical activity to engage in. But also the creation of music itself is a really joyous, rewarding, creative endeavour, and I think that there are too many barriers for people to get involved in that. Often we expect people to be an absolute expert, a virtuoso on their instrument, and they may or may not have any training, formal or otherwise, in an instrument. They might have physical or cognitive barriers to engaging with music in that form, in that way. And so what I wanted to do, inspired by things like the iHarp, things like the I think it's called Bloom, the generative music app by Brian Eno and his collaborators on that project. And what I wanted to do is create a way of engaging in and influencing and producing music that doesn't rely on formal training in a musical instrument, music theory, all these sorts of things. The only way to influence the way that the music will happen is by expressing your emotions through your facial expression. Now, everybody, or at least the vast majority of people, should be able to express how they feel by arranging their face in such a way. It happens naturally when we're feeling sad, happy, any of the emotions. There's 7 sort of basic emotions, 7 primal basic emotions that I'm going to be covering in this project. So happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, a neutral expression, or no visible emotion, and whatever the last one is that I've forgotten. Surprise, there we go. So how I want people to influence and participate in creating the music for my project, for emotional response, is to do away with all of this kind of technical learning of a musical instrument, that traditional way that we engage with and create music. And I want people to just be emotionally expressive, to express their emotions through their face, as everybody does naturally, and can also, especially on the side of like actors and so on, we can express emotions that we might not necessarily be feeling as well. And that's what I want my audience to do, who will then become the performers of the music in collaboration with the computer program. I've found some open source code that takes images and can identify faces within those images, and then can also match the data from this face and how it's arranged and so on with data sets, and identify to a lesser or greater extent of confidence which of these 7 emotions is being expressed. So I'm going to take that information and use that as an input for my program, and the program then will respond to the facial expressions of my audience and produce music that evokes those very same emotions that are being expressed. They might not be the same emotions that the audience is feeling. What I'm hoping is that people will identify what's happening and will deliberately engage with the camera and interact in a way where they're deliberately trying to express facial expressions that influence and change the music. So I imagine a lot of people might be going in kind of curious, in a kind of a neutral state, maybe slightly happy, maybe a little bit bored, however they're feeling. I don't expect to have those really extreme emotions of disgust or anger, fear within the audience as they enter, but once they realise what's happening, I'm hoping that they're going to sort of contort their faces and try and look really angry or surprised and all this kind of thing. And I really hope it's going to be a really playful, enjoyable experience for the audience, and that they're going to hear some really interesting things musically in a way that I'm not going to be able to predict exactly how any performance of this piece will happen, and it's going to be open-ended and last basically for as long as the installation is open for. So you start the program, it just runs continuously, and it will adapt and change depending on the audience and how they're interacting with the camera. Okay, so I think that explains what my intentions are for this project. I'm going to be documenting the whole process, so creating the musical material, those gestures, trying to match up sounds, melodic fragments, and different approaches that will best represent each of these emotions as I've discussed. As we have discussed, one of those emotions is disgust, and this is, I think, going to be the most challenging emotion to try and convey, because I think it's also, we don't really listen to very much music in order to feel disgust. We don't really seek out the feeling of, we don't want to be disgusted, unless we're the sort of person who watches like horror films and so on, but there's so much overlap between fear and disgust. Trying to determine a difference and trying to distinguish between both fear and disgust, to me, is going to be one of the interesting sides of this project, but also one of the challenges. This should be a really fun project, and I will take you along and try and explain what I'm doing as I get through each different stage. So yeah, welcome to the journey.